Chapter 37. We arrive in 10 minutes. Prepare to disembark. Shouts echoed through the train cars, spurring me from my sleep. After several hours of chatting, laughing, and playing small games, everyone had gotten tired and drifted off to sleep. The entire car with the bar was littered with unconscious bodies. Of course, we hadn't been sleeping for long. In order to pass the time, everyone found something to do. Besides the usual, there was a period when some of the knights sparred. In order to not damage anything, they did something similar to fencing. Over half the elites were knights in the first place, so many went up to challenge themselves and have fun. Even I went up, taking a light sword and utilizing my non-existent sword skill to try and poke the other knight. Even after 5 minutes of trying though, I couldn't so much as touch them. It made for a nice laugh. And after that, the warlocks went up and let out displays of spellcasting. Many of the spells let out were nothing more than parlor tricks, like little sparks of fire or little droplets of water being thrown at the opponent. It was funny seeing the reactions of those who got bit by a spark, only for the other to stumble when their hair was blown back by a sharp gust of wind. Things of that nature filled the ride, and I watched for the most part, a smile on my face. It felt like I was back in college messing around with some friends at a sporting event. And it all helped me realize that, in the end, these people were all just young adults who liked to have fun. The magisterium and the war against the scourge put a lot of pressure on them, especially the elites, but that didn't mean they didn't still want to kick back and let loose. They were only a couple of years younger than me, so I had no issue relating and getting along with them. Most would feel like these elites were unapproachable professionals wholly focused on growing their strength. But what kid was interested in that? They knew how to have fun just like anybody else their age. They didn't suddenly lose their humanity with their talent. So the ride was refreshing for me. I feel like everyone had gotten closer. Just like me, everyone else also woke up with the shouts. We had slept for around an hour or two, a power nap sufficient to revitalize us for whatever was awaiting us at this military base. In the car, bodies littered the couches and floor, all of them slowly rising and stretching. I heard groans and moans, along with a few who didn't actually wake up and continued to snore. One of which was Tana, who I saw passed out in the corner of the room. When I thought back, I couldn't help but laugh. After a few hours of constant drinking, she finally couldn't hold it and left to go vomit. Umara was stuck holding her hair back. But shockingly, after recovering for a bit, she was right back at it. She proclaimed that she needed to build her tolerance, but reality was cruel as she hurled again not even an hour after trying to drink more. After that, we pinned her down and forced her to rest, which ended with her passing out. That was about halfway through the ride. Hopefully she would be recovered enough to walk straight. I thought of that as I went over and shook her. "Hey, Tana." She didn't respond, even after I shook her harder and tapped her face. Then, Umara walked over. "I got it. */*. She summoned some water, pouring it over Tana's head. And the reaction was violent. "Ah. Stop. Please. Wake up." Umara was rather merciless with her words, but still gently helped Tana up. To my great surprise though, she didn't seem hungover at all. Tana just got up and cracked her neck before letting out a long breath. "Eh? How long was I out?" "We're here, so you do the math." "I don't like math." "Whatever. I need to pee." With a yawn, Tana walked out of the car in search of a restroom. I stood there, a bit stunned, before connecting the dots. So knights can resist the effects of alcohol. No wonder she could drink so much. Tana had drank non-stop for hours despite her having no experience with alcohol. I suppose it was only her strong body as a knight that allowed her to do that. I sighed in slight envy. How lucky. They can't get hungover. Yes, their bodies are naturally resistant to poisoning. It's why I wasn't worried. Millimeters. Well, how are you doing? Fine, actually. Those cigars help your body filter the alcohol as well, so I'm feeling good. Oh, and here. Umara suddenly handed back the cigar. It was barely a quarter burnt, so I took out my golden cigar case and stashed it for later. The sight of it caused Dumar's eyes to widen a bit. After that, everyone gathered in the main car we had first arrived in. There, the instructors were briefing everyone. The orientation will simply consist of the most basic things you need to know. Tomorrow is when you'll receive a tour of the base and get to know your daily routine. Just listen to the commander so he can quickly get you situated in your barracks. The puppet master gave those words, and not long after, we all felt the rail come to a gradual stop. I nudged Umaro with my elbow. Hey, what are the military ranks? Oh, I was tested on those. Hang on. She took a second to think before counting with her 10 fingers. Ensign, First Ensign, Corporal, Sergeant, Master Sergeant, First Sergeant, Commander, Chief Commander, First Commander, and Brigadier. Oh. Those are the infantry ranks in the military, and they go by your authority. The commander we're going to meet would be an Authority 7. And the intelligence ranks have different names. All right. I nodded, and right after, the door to the car opened, revealing the terminal we arrived in. Unlike the one in the capital, this one wasn't fancy or very well kept. The floors were made of gray stone bricks, and across the way from all the rails, there was what looked like a large warehouse with tons of cargo in it, probably stuff that needed to be transported. There were also many troops moving about the plaza. I took a look at the standard uniforms. Because this world's military wasn't facing a human or generally intelligent enemy, there was no need for camouflage. It was likely that such measures would be useless before a beast's senses. Plus, guns and bullets weren't the primary mode of combat. Therefore, entire sets of steel armor were much more important than cloth that could blend into the surroundings. So instead, the uniforms were sets of clothing that, in their most basic setup, were designed to be worn under armor. This meant that they were sleek and generally comfortable to wear. The fabrics of the shirts, for instance, seemed to be some variant of polyester derived from a plant. This made them flexible, smooth, and relatively tough. Some of my sets of clothing were polyester, in fact. And the pants were like jeans, but thinner and more flexible. They were belted and meant to fit nicely under a set of armor. If I had to describe it, they would be a heavy-duty pair of dress slacks. As for the colors, they went by the themed colors of the Kingdom of Dragon Tongue, which were black, white, and blue. The shirt was entirely blue, and the pants were black like formal slacks with blue lines running down their seams. Some were also wearing coats, ones that looked like wall jackets. And then there was the commander in front of us who was wearing a formal overcoat with some medals and badges pinned on it. One of our instructors, a fourth-year teacher who I hadn't met before, went forward to greet him. Commander Bosnan. Instructor Grisha. Welcome to Calatrop Base. They shook hands before the instructor turned to us. All right students, listen up. Most of your arrangements will be handled by Commander Bosnan here. He is your leader for the duration of your stay here. You will listen to his instructions as if they were orders from us. Besides, in a year, you all will join the military and he will outrank you anyway, so act according to your position. Now, I'll hand you off. Go ahead, Commander. Thank you, Instructor. The commander stepped forward after we had all piled out of the rail. To the side, we could see all our chests and cargo being hauled out and into the base by some other soldiers. The commander looked over each of us before speaking. You all will address me as commander. I have been given an authority by the first commander overseeing this base to take care of you all while you are here. This means you are my responsibility, and my words will therefore dictate the next month of your lives. Failure to follow orders will result in suspension for the rest of your trip as well as rigorous training designed to promote reflection and introspection. Am I clear? Yes, Commander. I spoke in response, along with the rest of the group. They all seemed familiar with this kind of environment, and they had indeed been to these places plenty of times before. Starting in the third year, students would work alongside the military. That was because most students graduated after their third year, so it was designed to help them get familiar with working at a military base in advance. This meant that all these fourth-year students around me were no strangers to a military environment, responding and acting properly. Many backs had already been straightened, including mine. The commander also seemed to know this since he didn't yell and wasn't making a scream in response to his words. There was no need to drill these things into us. The third years, on the other hand, would likely go through a period of training designed to teach them the basics of operating at a military base. They would be yelled at, have to yell in response, and would need to move about in strict ways. I was glad I didn't have to go through that, skipping straight to the good stuff. Follow me, and we will assign your rooms. The commander turned, the students all following without bothering to look at their instructors. Right now, this commander had the greatest authority. We walked into the base, and I took everything in as we went. The entire base was designed in a hemispherical way. The walls were arched in the front with 4 sections separated by towers. At the base of the hemisphere, it tapered off and circled around a massive fort. The fort was built in the rear portion of the base, separated from the walls by 3 distinct fields. In the midst of these fields were all kinds of things separated by their purpose. For instance, in one field there was a bunch of training equipment. In another was combat equipment like armored vehicles and caches of supplies. And another was filled with structures attached to the walls, likely for extra security. And attached to the side of the fort were a few large structures, likely the barracks. During our walk there, nobody spoke a word, so I didn't either even though I had questions I wanted to ask Umara. Finally, we arrived at one of the buildings. The commander spun around and spoke. This is the male barracks. Just as a forewarning, any fraternizing between the men and women will result in suspension. I'm sure you all can keep it in your pants for a month, so please don't put us in an awkward situation. A few people chuckled, one of them being Umara. Her weird smile made me snicker. Then, we all saw some wagons roll over, their backs loaded with all our chests. All right, all the men. Grab your luggage and head inside. Pick any room and bunk you want. Each room holds 2 people. And ladies, follow me. The commander waved all the women over. Umara nudged me as she left, making my brows raise. We seemed to be getting quite close. After watching their backs for a moment, I turned and found Fiden. With a smile, I smacked his shoulder. Hey, let's room together. Oh. All right. He easily agreed, and we went to find our chests. I quickly found mine, grabbing it before heading inside. The entry door led into a long hallway, which I walked down with Fiden behind me. Which one? I suggest the ones around the middle. Not too close to the entrance where the commander comes banging on your door, and not too close to the bathrooms where everyone is constantly coming and going. All right. Middle it is. Picking a room in the center of the hallway, I opened the door and walked in. The small room I entered had 2 beds on either corner across the way as well as a single bench, table, 2 chairs, and 2 dressers to store items. Everything was generally worn out. The floor was wooden and there was a single light in the center of the ceiling. No luxury to speak of. I sighed, thinking that I had taken my extravagantly luxurious room at the Black Spider Hotel for granted. The only thing worse than this would be living outside or in a tent. As for the bed, when I pressed on it, my hand didn't sink down. It was pretty stiff, with a wood base and thin mattress filled with who knows what. The pillow wasn't much better, and there was only 1 sheet and 1 wool blanket. I was quickly figuring out that I packed light. Hell, I should have brought an entire bed. I might have if I knew this piece of crap was waiting for me here. And naturally, Fiden was prepared. He had his own pillow and set of blankets that he draped over the bed. Seeing me glance over there, he turned to me and smiled. Would you like a blanket? No, that's fine. Live and learn, right? Ha ha, indeed. I remember my first time on a base. Stressful and unaccommodating, was how I'd describe it. Sounds about right. I chuckled and took a seat on the bed. At the very least, it looked and smelled clean, so they weren't making me sleep in used sheets. Not long after that, we heard one of the instructors call all the men. Heading out of our room, The instructor let us know about some things for the following day. Things like where the cafeteria was, where the bathrooms were, where we needed to report the next morning and when. After that final briefing, we were all allowed to finally retire for the night. Tomorrow, there was a lot waiting for us. Chapter 38. The next morning, I woke up bright and early to an alarm from my Ariel. And it wasn't the only thing I got. After rolling over and spending a few minutes to wake up, I tapped the device and saw that I had a message. It was from Rayla, and attached was an image. My brows raised as I opened it. The picture was from the auction that came at the end of every month. However, I suddenly remembered that not only was this auction last night, but it was the major auction accompanied by Vatsy's gala. I suddenly sat up. I missed the gala. Damn it. I cursed while palming my forehead. I obviously knew I couldn't go, but what a shame. I had only been to one gala before, and it was an amazing experience. Taking a moment, I started to count the months, and after some basic addition, I realized that I wouldn't have to miss the next one that would occur at the end of the year. I sighed in relief and slumped back down into my bed again. What's this gala? Then, Fiden asked with drowsiness. I had woken him up. I spoke while sighing. Just a party. It's pretty fun, but it doesn't happen very often. I see. He nodded and yawned before climbing out of bed. I suggest you use the bathrooms before everyone else does. It gets crowded and smelly. True. Following, I grabbed some items before strolling to the bathroom. It was a large tiled space with stalls, shower curtains, and lots of metal bowls. Basic but functional. And we weren't the only ones to wake up a bit earlier. The few male instructors, including the puppet master, along with some other guys, were already there and getting ready for the day. Everyone was quiet, just minding their own business. Nobody was in the mood to chat so early in the morning. I went through my morning routine, but as I was brushing my teeth, I suddenly remembered the picture Rayla sent me. I quickly pulled it back up. And I couldn't help the grin that surfaced. There were actually two pictures. The first was of Rayla and the others like Plex, Libitus, and Tovex. They stood stiffly in a group, everyone smiling except Plex, who was too busy drinking. And the second picture was of Rayla by herself, dressed in a rather sexy black outfit and blowing a kiss into the picture. I got a nice shot of all the goodies, by design. Well, isn't that something? I laughed before closing it, going through the rest of my morning with a smile. She sure knew how to cheer me up. Then, not long after finishing my routine, I heard some shouts that shook our building. Be ready in 15 minutes and assemble outside the barracks. It was our commander, and his shouts woke everyone who wasn't already out of bed. After that, the bathrooms and hallways were flooded as everyone rushed to get ready. On the other hand, Fiden and I took our time and headed outside. I enjoyed the morning breeze cooling my face. My coat never allowed me to get cold or hot, so the wind felt refreshing instead of making me shiver. Seeing as how Fiden and I were the only ones out, I grabbed the golden cigar case from my inner pocket. After lighting the quarter-used cigar, I took a few deep breaths of smoke, feeling the rejuvenating effects that washed away some of my drowsiness and woke me up. Not long after, people began filing out of the barracks, gathering outside. Not far from us outside the building adjacent to the male bunks, we could see all the girls gather, the two sides peeking over at each other. Then, the commander came, gathering both groups before announcing, "All right, listen in. We're going to guide you through your routine for the next month. I'm going to give you all a tour of the places you need to know and remember. We are also going to assign everyone their squads. These squads can change at any time, but likely won't unless there is good reason. So be prepared to get familiar with them. Now, follow me." The commander waved, and everyone followed him into the command center of the base. Upon arrival, I looked around and saw various facilities and many officers carrying out their duties. To my surprise though, not many of them were powerful. Some officers were completely ordinary. Well, I suppose it shouldn't have been surprising. Behind every soldier were a dozen logistical officers. It took no small amount of manpower to operate the war machine, and it couldn't possibly be entirely composed of magi. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of draft or mandatory service for everyone. After entering the command center, the commander briefed us on several of the facilities. One was an intelligence post, the officers within being responsible for gathering and analyzing the movements and patterns of the scourge near the base. They were also responsible for collecting intelligence gathered by squads that went on reconnaissance missions and making sense of it, compiling it all into actionable data. Then, there was the office sector, a large area devoted to the bureaucratic side of the base. Here, many officers were busy filling out tons of paperwork and collecting mission reports from the various squads. Then there was an area that held several briefing rooms. Inside these rooms were magical projectors and devices that could display information pertaining to a mission. Before being sent out on a mission, we would come here to get a rundown. After that, we toured the rest of the base. We were introduced to the mess hall where breakfast, lunch, and dinner were served at regular intervals. We were taken to the medical building, a place many never wished to get familiar with. Then there was the armory where we could get supplies, some recreation centers for entertainment, a training facility for physical fitness, a maintenance facility for gear, and a storage area for miscellaneous items. There was even a chapel for the believers. The commander spent several hours giving us this tour, and we also met several key officers who would be helping us during our stay. We were barely done before lunch came around. At that time, the commander finally let us go to the mess hall and get some chow. Everyone flooded into the building, and I noticed that everyone was generally familiar with everything. And I had no issue simply following in their footsteps, getting myself food. It wasn't a buffet. There was a long line of pots and trays with various foods in them, and there was a limit to how much you could take of each one. But you could indeed go back for seconds and thirds. At first glance, I didn't recognize most of the food. It didn't look particularly appetizing, but I knew that was coming from my perspective as someone who almost always ate out at restaurants. Still, I grabbed from the trays that smelled better than the others and soon had a full plate. I went and took a seat at an empty table. How sad, sitting by yourself. Umara came up behind me, taking a seat on my right. With her was Tana, and Fiden arrived not long after. I smiled at her and started eating. At the same time, I asked a question on my mind. What kind of positions do ordinary people occupy in the military? They are intelligence. There are two ranking systems in the military, one for infantry, and one for intelligence. There are no power requirements for intelligence, unlike infantry. But they do have to be educated. The kingdom has several schools specifically for training and teaching those officers. That's what I thought. This is rather common knowledge, but you don't know it. Did you entirely skip the first few years of classes at the magisterium? But even then, you learn some of these things during school when growing up. Umar looked at me from the side, going on another one of her deductive rabbit holes. Where did you grow up? Far from here. What city? It was a village, called Ymir Village. Really? That's surprising though. You don't look like you've come from a village. And you're too educated to not have gone to a proper school, which only exists in cities. Look at you, sniffing around for more secrets. Am I that interesting to you? The fact that your origins are a secret does in fact make you very interesting. She gave me a grin, causing me to laugh. This girl really did like digging into my business. But I also couldn't help but notice the others nodding with thoughtful expressions. Seriously, Umara was turning me into some kind of hot topic, as if my existence here was some kind of conspiracy. Well, it kind of was. But that was beside the point. After dodging more of Umara's sneaky questions, lunch finished and we were given some free time to explore. However, we were also given some sheets which informed us of our squads. Everyone gathered and read the lists, and chatter ensued. I quickly found my name and read the names of those I was grouped with. Fiden, Umara, Vetsman, and Tana. Not a bad lineup, but I don't know who Vetsman is. I smiled. Besides this Vetsman who I didn't know about, the group was perfect. Fiden and Tana were knights who were skilled in handling enemies up close. The two of them would be able to keep everything away from Umara and me while we supported them from behind. And Umara alone was a great partner to have by my side. She knew many utility spells, including some area spells and spells that compensated for the weaknesses of my guns, like their sound. Oh, Vetsman. It seems we have nothing to worry about. After reading it, Fiden nodded from beside me, causing me to ask, "Who is that? Why don't you greet him yourself?" He pointed, and I looked over. Hoibert was a stocky man, tall and built like a football linebacker. I had thought he was on the bigger side, but this Vetsman almost put him to shame. Well over 6 feet tall, Vetsman walked over with a towering figure that looked down on even me. I could see his muscles through the white robes he wore, and his aura was awfully threatening. He was someone who I'd never met before, likely one of the topmost elites who we never saw much of. His skin was a deep brown, and he had long black hair that took nothing away from the sharp jawline and raging masculinity. It was like he radiated testosterone. He walked up to me, seeing as how my focus was on him. And being completely honest with myself, I felt a bit inferior in front of his hulking figure. But I still straightened my back to greet him, putting out my hand. "You're Vetsman?" "Yes. John, right? I've heard about you. Nice to finally meet you." He smiled, exposing his pearly white teeth while shaking my hand with his bare paws. I couldn't even close my grip, and my strength was naturally far below his. He was a knight through and through. But his robes reminded me of something else. Why did they resemble priest robes? Maybe I was just overthinking it and this guy just really liked fancy white clothing. After our greeting, Vetsman went around to the others to exchange pleasantries. As a group, we would need to get familiar with each other. Trust was one of the most important factors of any team. It seemed Vetsman was a good guy. Nobody had any trouble talking to him. And while he was talking to the others, Umara came over to me and whispered in my ear. "He's rank 4, a knight specializing in defense and protection like Hoibert. He's seriously strong, and with you, our group has basically no weaknesses. In fact, we could very well be one of the most powerful groups on this trip." Rank 4. The puppet master seems to think highly of me. I couldn't help but smile a bit. I wasn't even an elite yet, and I was being grouped with people in the top 10. Umara was 8th, Vetsman was 4th, and Fiden was 2nd. While Tana was our weaker link, she was still ranked 15 out of 28 elites. And she specialized in speed anyway, not sheer strength, so she should be able to fill some gaps in our composition. For example, she would probably end up our scout. I couldn't help but think that despite not being an elite, the puppet master was treating me as one in the upper echelons of the group. And at the very least, I knew that I could pull my weight. After all, I had been training with all the elites for the past several weeks. If I couldn't keep up, I probably would have been kicked out a while ago. From the side, Umara smiled at me. "I can confidently say that you're one of the most powerful people in the elites. Your guns are amazingly lethal, making you too good at killing things. So if you're allowed to do as you please, only an overwhelmingly tough enemy would survive. This group is practically built to protect you. Well, even without me, it would be a powerful group. Yes, but with you, it's even more so." I hummed, glancing at Umara before nudging her with my elbow. She nudged me back with a stifled giggle. After that, we were called by the rest of the group, gathering together to discuss some things. I had worked with Tana and Umara several times, so I knew them and their skill sets well. But I didn't know much about Fiden despite the fact that we had become good friends recently, and Vetsman was still a mystery even though he looked about as reliable as someone could ever be. So for now, we talked about each other's abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, quickly understanding everything our group was capable of. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that there wasn't much that we weren't capable of. Vetsman utilized a tower shield befitting his large body and strength, capable of going toe-to-toe with authority 5 beasts. His weapon of choice was a spear, but he could also use a sword for when he wasn't being weighed down by his shield, making him very versatile. and Fiden was naturally a swordsman who excelled in both speed and strength. He basically had Tana's strengths and none of her weaknesses while possessing amazing technique. And then there was me. I laid out my abilities and weaknesses clearly. After all, I needed to be protected to some extent. I couldn't let them think that I was perfectly fine on my own and then get killed out of carelessness. After describing my guns and how they worked in principle, Vetsman and Fiden were able to come to an understanding. And with all our abilities on the table, everyone was able to come to a conclusion as to how we needed to operate. Suddenly, I thought of something humorous. Back on Earth, as a boy in the prime years of his life, I had played no shortage of video games of all kinds. And as I worked with more people, I couldn't help but recall my experiences in those games to help me with forming a battle plan in my mind. Some video games required you to engage in quick yet strategic decision-making, have good pattern recognition, and know how to use the skills, powers, and environment at your disposal to fight for the best outcome. All my training with the Puppet Master's scenarios had forced me to utilize all these things, but the fact that some random video games could help me with real-life battles was a funny concept. Anyway, after a bit more conclusive discussion, we determined that Vetsman would be the core of our formation. His direct support would be Fiden, while Tana would drift between everyone. Umara and I would be paired in the back. She was responsible for assuring that I could operate at full capacity, and I would be responsible for protecting her while also providing ranged firepower for the rest of the team. Of course, our strategies would have to change according to the enemy and terrain, but we knew our jobs, which was most important. Chapter 39. Since we had our team, and everyone got along just fine, we decided to move around together. We had been introduced to all the facilities of the base, but there were still some things we needed to know. For one, we had to know about certain protocols. For the most part, they were standard. After all, this was the military. There would be very few times when protocols deviated from what was in the book. Still, after we had some free time, the commander came back and gathered us together. For the next few hours after that, he went over all the necessary protocols. Specifically, he explained what we needed to do when missions arose. For the time being, we wouldn't be sent out by ourselves. Each squad would be paired with another soldier from the base who would primarily be responsible for navigation and general oversight. After all, the soldiers here knew the lay of the land much better than us. When the time came for a mission, everyone would gather in the briefing room before being assigned a task that would involve us going beyond the walls and out into the wilderness. After our briefing, we would be given supplies for the mission. This included packs of food, water, medical supplies, and other equipment we would need. And after gathering everything we needed, everyone would meet at the gates for final preparations before heading off. Then after returning, there was a process of taking damage reports. Injuries, loss of equipment, expenditures, and other miscellaneous things would be logged before we could retire. That was basically the gist. I couldn't really bother to hear the extensive details, and it didn't seem like the commander cared too much about making sure we knew. After all, this wasn't our first rodeo. With that, the day gradually came to a close. Missions would be assigned in cycles. This meant that different squads would go out on different days. Also, not every mission would involve killing something. Sometimes it would be a perimeter patrol, and sometimes it would be a search and destroy mission. If things got really exciting, then this base would be raided by a wave of beasts and we would need to help defend. But the chances of that happening were low since this base wasn't located on the true front lines of the war front. This place was merely here to fill in gaps and make sure that enemies didn't slip through. We also needed to clear anything that tried to nest and develop itself between the cracks, making sure our allies in distant lands didn't have to worry about being attacked from the sides or back. So there wasn't a whole lot of action. And while there were still frequent hunting missions, they would be split between all the squads, not leaving much for any single group. Well, I was completely fine with that. I still had yet to kill a real scourge beast. I didn't need to jump straight into a frontal battle. Easing my way in was preferable. Like that, We ended our second day uneventfully. The night concluded after everyone had eaten dinner and went back to the barracks. The next day, we were supposed to receive our first orders. A schedule would be given, and the puppet master had said that the elites were going to be some of the first to deploy on real combat missions. So I went to sleep with excited anticipation. I wasn't all that fearful, especially since my squad was damn powerful. I woke up at some point during the night, not to my aerial alarm, but to a weird feeling. I didn't really sense anything other than a faint omen in the back of my head. My heart was also beating pretty hard, enough to send noticeable tremors through my bed. I sat up, remaining there for several minutes. And then, I heard it. Asterisk were asterisk. An ear-piercing alarm suddenly sounded through the whole base. Phaidon instantly woke, as did everyone else who had functional hearing. His eyes widened as he looked at me. That's not good. No shit. I frowned while jumping out of bed. I had a hunch as to what was going on. There was really only one thing that could send this entire base into high alert. Sure enough, I heard several shouts outside the barracks. Enemy attack. All hands to battle stations. I could hear a commotion outside as all the soldiers on base instantly jumped to the call, rushing out to get ready. I decided to arm myself for battle as well, equipping my standard gear for when I would train. The coat was the last thing to go on as Phaidon and I ran out of our room with the others. All students, gather here. I heard the puppet master shout, catching everyone's attention with a light that appeared over his head. Right now, the sun was just barely peeking over the horizon. It was dark, but just light enough to see clearly. Still, the beacon drew us to him. The girls and boys gathered as all the soldiers ran past us. He spoke with utter seriousness. This is not a drill. The base is about to come under siege, and all of you are about to become important defenders. It's time to step up. Find your squads and gather before the gates for further instructions. Elites, stay behind. Everyone else, get moving. With his command, a vast majority of the students ran off toward the gates. As for us elites, we stuck around as he gave out more commands. Listen up. I want all the warlocks to head up the walls. I will be up there and will be your commanding officer for this battle, so listen to my orders. As for the knights, you will report to the commander and get ready to engage in close combat. So if you haven't already, get your damn armor on and move. Go. With those words, everyone turned and ran off, including the puppet master. Before we got far though, he shouted again. John. I'm giving you full autonomy, so get into the central tower and start raining hell. Yes sir. Umara, go with him. Understood. We both smiled and ran off. During our tour of the base, we had gotten familiar with the walls. They were designed to defend against sieges like this, and there were 5 primary towers spread evenly along the walls that acted as defensive shooting positions for warlocks. And in the middle was the largest central tower. It had several levels and overlooked the entire base. It was the perfect vantage point for someone like me. Umara and I rushed up there along with dozens of other soldiers. Many of them were yelling and screaming orders, and at some point, we could hear explosions. After some time and squeezing through people, we climbed up the staircases and got to the top of the wall. That's when we took a second and looked over. In the distance, we could see a dark wave of beasts surging toward us. They were a thick tide that quickly covered any visible ground. It was a bit overwhelming, seeing that many beasts rushing toward us. I really wondered what I could do here. In situations like these, warlocks who could cast area of effect spells were the most effective. But I knew I was still valuable. That was especially when I saw some of the much bigger beasts in that ocean of monsters. They would no doubt be my targets. My guns did a lot of damage, but only to singular targets, so they would be the best to focus on instead of just firing randomly into the crowd. Let's go. Umara pulled me along, helping me focus. Like that, we rose to the top of the central tower. From there, I could overlook everything. Who are you guys? Where is your commanding officer? Not long after we got there though, we were suddenly yelled at by a soldier. He seemed to be someone with a high rank, a powerful warlock from my guess. But I didn't know him and didn't particularly care right now, so I responded succinctly. We're students under the Puppet Master's command. He's ordered us to be here and give long-range support. Puppet Master. Fine. Just don't get in the way. Otherwise I'm sending you down. Understood. Glad that this guy wasn't making things difficult, I moved with Umara over to an empty window. The inside of this tower was built with warlocks in mind. So not only did it have a great vantage point, but the firing windows were large and plentiful, yet built in a way that would still protect us. There wasn't a single part of the battlefield that I wouldn't be able to shoot. Like that, we set up and got ready. Even as the monsters approached, I could see dozens of spells being launched into the distance. All of them exploded inside the monster tide, most creating flames and disrupting their momentum. Not only that, but there were special weapons used along the walls, cannons to be exact. Of course, these weren't generic cannons but special ones utilizing magic. They were built with enchantments and could launch huge balls of fire that would explode like a bomb. Of course, it couldn't fire quickly, but they lined the walls and were operated efficiently. Like that, holes were punched in the advancing armies. Still, they blindly charged forward. Up above, I took out my sniper, getting into a comfortable position and looking through my scope. I took a close look at the monsters. And they were grotesque. They looked like mutated abominations. Tigers with spines shooting out of their backs, bears with bone spurs jutting out of its body, lizards with irregular scales that made them seem like a bed of razors, and many other monsters I couldn't recognize. Of course, some looked more normal than others, but it was clear that the scourge really was just a monstrous collection of unintelligent creatures. They thirsted for nothing but destruction and human flesh. Some were more mutated than others, and these were the stronger creatures. Not only that, but a larger size generally meant more power, so there were many large monsters that stood a few heads above the rest. It was clear that the Puppet Master dialed down the grotesque looks for us in training, but otherwise, they looked and operated exactly how I'd known. Otherwise, what use was his special training? After finding the familiarity, I calmed myself and spoke. Umara. Yes. How long can you kill the sound? If I focus on nothing but that spell, I can do so for several hours. Could you? I asked, not doubting if she actually could, but if she was willing to do so. To simply cast a single spell for several hours was no doubt boring and tedious. It might be fine for the first hour, but after that, she would end up just sitting by me and doing nothing but supporting me. But without her spell, I would draw too much attention. It didn't matter how much was going on. My guns were simply too loud and pulled the attention of everything within a mile. That meant this tower would be attacked and I wouldn't be able to work. But if nothing could hear me, then I would be a silent killer. The battle would continue as normal while I simply killed everything I laid eyes on. I felt bad asking her for this, but thankfully, she didn't seem to mind much. Sure. I'll support you. Just do what you're good at. Thank you. I smiled at her, and after getting a smile in return, I turned around and focused in. A moment later, I heard the surrounding noise turn muffled. This was the normal effect of her sound spell, especially when she confined it to a small space. After all, I was the only person she needed to muffle. The windows in this tower were placed nicely. I was actually able to lay down and aim through some windows near the floors. These windows were meant to provide a line of fire down toward the base of the walls. Steadying my weapon on the ground and pointing the barrel through the window, I took aim at one of the big enemies. It was several meters tall, towering over the others nearby, and making it a large but tough target. And without empowering any of my shots, I fired. *zip*. My subsonic rounds produced untraceable sound as they pierced into the face of that behemoth. The massive beast had naturally tough armor that almost looked like rock, so I aimed for its only vulnerability. Several spells had already exploded on its body harmlessly, the beast continuing to truck forward. But as soon as the bullet landed, it recoiled in shock. *roar*. It let out a pained bellow as the round scrambled its fleshy face, shattering what little armor it had around its eyes and mouth. However, it didn't do any real damage, that much I realized. So with the shot as the gauge, I empowered the rifle and corrected my aim just slightly. *zip***. *scree***. This time, the beast let out a scream as the bullet accurately hit its eye. Blood exploded from the wound as it thrashed around in pain. I didn't let up, firing more into its face with increasingly powerful shots. And after around a dozen more bullets, the beast finally fell, crashing into its surrounding army and crushing several of its kin. I took a long breath after that, settling myself before finding another. As time passed, the army in the distance only grew. Even though I could see the end of it, there were still thousands of these beasts moving toward us. And among those armies were a few dozen massive behemoths. They marched alongside the smaller ones, giving off a grave presence. That one behemoth I killed took a good amount out of me. Empowering that many shots, especially ones that could kill a beast such as that, consumed great amounts of my psyche. But after I had created the spark with my cultivation in Dreamland, I had gained a great amount of passive psyche regeneration. The spark initially only seemed to boost my cognitive power. But psyche was directly tied to the mind and its thoughts. This meant that, the more powerful my mind, the more powerful and plentiful my psyche. So the spark, which acted as an engine for my mind, afforded me greater power regeneration. I hadn't gotten the chance to really test it since I immediately left for this trip, but now, I would be putting it all into action. Without much rest, I took aim and fired at another behemoth, working to bring it down. And without realizing, I happened to be helping this base much more than I initially realized. Chapter 40 Roar***. Another behemoth fell, marking the 13th that I had killed. Of course, doing so took hours and all the energy I had. What had initially been morning turned into afternoon. Now, the sun was beginning to lower, bringing us into evening. I had only left twice during the day in order to eat once and take a piss. Otherwise, I had been laying inside the central tower the entire time. And Umara had never left my side. Operating her sound spell, while tedious and boring, wasn't that difficult for her. If anything, she utilized this time as a training opportunity. At the very least, I was working harder, so I could confidently say that I wasn't wasting her support. But I was reaching my limit mentally. I had gone through my entire psyche pool a few times over, constantly regenerating and using any dregs of power I got when I got it. I had basically been running on empty for half the day. And it was when I hit my 13th kill that I finally couldn't hold on anymore, the gun disappearing from my hand as I could no longer maintain the communion. I grunted as I felt my head throb. Thankfully I wasn't also focused on surviving. With the tower and this many warlocks around me, I didn't have to worry about getting hit even if spells were launched at us. I just lay there, and a few moments later, I suddenly heard the surroundings get louder. Now that Umara wasn't muffling sound, I could hear everything clearly. Unfortunately, it also hurt my head to suddenly get an influx of sound. Come on. Let's get you into the bunks. You've done enough. I heard Umara mutter as she helped pull my body up. I initially wanted to refuse her help, but when I started to get to my feet, my headache multiplied until my vision blurred and the dizziness threatened to throw me off my feet. Umara slung my arm over her shoulder as I became unsteady, using her body to prop mine up as I finally stood. Given several seconds, I started to acclimate and feel better, but my mind was still drained of all its energy. We left the tower, making our way down the walls. And as we did so, there was a sudden shout. Damn, John. Where was that during training? The puppet master appeared in front of us, marching over with a wide grin. It was uncharacteristic of him to be so excited. Hey. Do you know what authority those monsters were? No. Authority 5. You just killed a dozen of those things. Congrats on officially becoming an elite. Now go get some rest. Umara, take care of him. Yes sir. Umara shouted back before continuing to carry me back down. She spoke as we finally descended the wall. Killing an Authority 5 Scourge Beast earns you the title of Elite. It's usually done as an Authority 4 and as a sign that you're really talented since you can kill above your authority. Normally, you need to kill it by yourself, have witnesses, and there needs to be a consensus that you unilaterally contributed to its death. But since you just killed a dozen, there's no need for that. Umara explained as we crossed the field, smiling at me as she finished. I've only ever killed 7, so congrats on becoming one of the top elites in a single day. It's just another Tuesday. How humble of you. She giggled as we arrived at the male barracks. Directly bringing me inside, I pointed her to my room. We entered and I was laid on my bed. After getting comfortable, I seemed to become more aware of my headache as it shook my brain. I also felt like I was going to pass out any second. For a moment I got worried since this base was still being sieged by monsters. But I knew that I had contributed as much as I could. I just had to trust that everyone else would be able to hold on. Before I even realized it, my body shut itself down without warning. Everything went dark, and I no longer felt any pain. A magic formation filled my mind. At its center was a single orb of fleeting lights that spun fast in orbiting patterns, yet slower than they should have been. I recognized it almost instantly, yet with some willpower and tricking my own mind, I maintained a suspended sort of awareness of what was going on. I focused on the formation. Its outer edges were all bright, indicating my comprehension. As for the dark parts that moved toward the center, I slowly started to analyze them as my focus moved along the lines. However, unlike the first time, my analysis now was far slower. It felt like I really had to focus on understanding it in order to make progress as opposed to last time when it all just came to me. Not only that, but some parts were indistinguishable. I felt like I could see them, but when I focused on them, they simply slipped my mind. I moved on from those parts, focusing on what I could as I made my way around the formation. And over time, the stars of Psyche that filled my mind began to converge. A few stars made their way into the spark at the center, adding to its power. With every star, I felt the spark make my mind more sensitive. However, because of my recent battle, the spark was drained and begging for replenishment. This made things progress slower. But that was also an unexpected boon. If the spark replenished itself faster, then I would have less time in this dream to work on the formation. On the other hand, the less energy it had, the slower my thoughts were and the slower my analysis was. It was an equal balance between energy and speed, both of which increased over time and yet decreased the time in the dream. I quickly caught on to this as the spark continued to replenish itself faster and faster, my focus becoming sharper yet my dream beginning to slip away. It got to the point where I even had awareness of my body despite still being in the dream, yet I hung on for as long as I could. And finally, I felt the dream shut down completely. Even with my eyes closed and my body unmoving, I knew that it had ended. My eyes fluttered open as I felt the changes. Before, I had comprehended a quarter of the formation. Now, that was about 35%, and my speed of thought had been enhanced accordingly. Now, it was 1.5 times faster. Everything else rose proportionally to that, like the amount of psyche I had in its passive regeneration. Plus, my mind now felt sharper than ever. I had recovered completely from that day of battle. Looking back, I really put everything I had into it. The monsters had been charging with undeniable momentum, so perhaps I felt afraid for both myself and those knights below me, but I didn't hesitate to pour out all of my power. Some behemoths were stronger than others. A few took an entire hour each to kill while some were easier. But no matter what, I had reached and surpassed my limits. Turns out, that also helped put me into dreamland for longer periods. Unfortunately, it seems that I would need to analyze the formation while awake in order to give myself material to work with while dreaming. I remembered those blurry messes blocking my progress, and it was obviously a lack of information. Dreamland wasn't omniscient. I needed to give it fuel to burn, but at least now I had some advantages to make use of. At some point, I opened my eyes and looked around. I could see light stream through the window of my room, making me think that it was the next day. I had passed out around evening when the sun was setting, so 12 hours of sleep would put me around morning of the next day. But when I stood and opened the raggedy curtains, I saw that the sun was actually setting. Oh! Lifting my wrist, I activated my aerial and saw the time. I had slept for over 20 hours. Asterisk rumble asterisk. At the moment, I felt my stomach churn. It was completely empty, and I was starving. I also felt my parched mouth. Quickly taking out a water container, I downed the entire thing. Ugh, I need food. I groaned as my stomach screamed for food, the water aggravating it. Leaving my room, I left the barracks and went over to the mess hall. Along the way, I saw people along the walls continuing to battle. The sight made me want to go over and fight, but I had to take care of myself first. My steps were hasty as I made my way by the kitchen, swiping a tray and filling it with whatever looked edible. I could barely even wait as I did that though, directly stuffing some smaller items like slices of bread into my mouth while grabbing more. Nobody said anything, so I didn't care much and turned around to find a nearby table. Then, I heard a voice. John. I froze and looked up with a face full of bread, finding Umar sitting with the rest of our assigned squad. They waved with a smile. Unfortunately, my hands were too full to return the greeting, so I just walked over and sat down. Tana laughed as I did so. I know you just became an elite, but did you really have to sleep for an entire day? I stared at her silently while chewing my bread. This took several seconds, during which everyone waited for my response. Once I swallowed, I spoke. How many Authority 5 single quote S have you killed? Ouch. Yeah, he got you there. Fiden and Vetsman smiled as they commented, making Tana lash out. Hey, who said we were comparing scores? Nobody. He just asked you a simple question. But there was an implication. I have no idea what you were talking about. Don't play dumb. Heh? We all laughed as Tana refused to lose. Once she calmed down, Umara nudged me with her elbow. How are you feeling? Fine. I recovered fully. Good. You pushed yourself a lot. She spoke comfortingly, making me feel a bit warm and fuzzy. Then, Vestman chimed in with a nod. You're really impressive, John. I fought one of those things today, and while I've killed several before, they don't get any easier. The most I've handled is 4 in a day. I have no idea how you killed a dozen in a single sitting. From the safety of the tower is hot. Compared to you guys, I have it a lot easier. You're the impressive ones, going toe-to-toe with those monsters. I could never. Don't say that. Given the same circumstances, I know you would perform just as well. You've got the determination and the heroic spirit. So don't belittle yourself. What you do is no less impressive than what anyone else does, no matter the position. I went silent for a bit, mulling over those words before nodding and sticking my hand out. Vetsman smiled and took it, the two of us shaking hands. Thank you, Vetsman. It was nothing unobvious. After yesterday, I can confidently say that I would fight fearlessly knowing you're there behind me. I appreciate that. And with you guys there protecting me, I know I have nothing to worry about. I spoke my genuine thoughts. I was vulnerable in battles, so having someone like Vetsman who was trustworthy and reliable gave me great peace of mind. Knowing that he could fight an Authority 5 head-on meant that the two of us could easily secure those kills. I would never have to worry about being overwhelmed. Then, I suddenly looked over at Amara who was smiling while staring down at her plate. With a grin, I put my arm around her shoulder. And let's not forget my favorite support warlock. Eh? How were you after an entire day of casting that spell? You don't talk about yourself much so I forget that you can get tired too. Oh, it wasn't too bad. I was tired, but not as much as you. Still, I couldn't have done it without you. I gave her a hug, patting her head once before letting go. Despite Amara liking to snoop around my private business, she didn't talk much otherwise. She simply stuck to herself and silently worked hard. I had noticed that over time. I made a note to check in on her more instead of just assuming she was doing just fine. "Look at these two." I heard Tana snicker, making me shrug. After that, we all finished eating before heading back out. The siege lasted into today as well, but by now it was close to ending. What remained was simply clearing out anything else that walked and taking care of the piling corpses. There were even some teams that came to claim loot. These people would cart out corpses before cutting them open and extracting the black crystals. These black crystals were poisonous to humans. Only after they were purified did they become white crystals, so in this raw form they were worthless. Every scourge beasted them as well, so they quickly piled up. I saw a large wooden crate filled with them. What was curious was how the crate gave off a faint black fog, like it was seeping that poisonous aura into the surroundings. I had never seen anything like that before, so I asked Tamara about it. Apparently, with enough crystals or a sufficiently powerful one, the magicka within them will manifest as a fog. A bunch of white crystals in a small space will do the same thing, except the fog would be white. That fog represents an increased density of magicka, and it's actually very beneficial to cultivate in. But doing so is naturally expensive. On the other hand, staying away from a poisonous black fog such as the one around that crate was generally advisable. Just being near it would make you feel sick, but figuring out how to counter that poison is also a form of training. After walking by, we all headed back to the wall. By now, things were calming down, but there was still work to be done. Deciding to help out while I was energetic, I went to head up the wall and pick off some strays. On the way though, I encountered the puppet master, who seemed happy to see me. Chapter 41. Nice of you to finally wake up. The puppet master greeted me with a half-smile. We shook hands on approach as he looked me up and down. "I see you've gotten a bit more powerful." "Good. As an elite, you have some catching up to do." "So killing an Authority 5 is a prerequisite for becoming one?" "It is. Just one is enough to get you on the list. You also earn points for each kill. I tallied you at 7 kills, so when we return, the list will update to reflect that." "That's it?" Tana suddenly spoke up in confusion. "I thought he killed 12? "He technically did, but not all of them were his sole work. It was difficult to tell and I wasn't watching the entire time, so after some talks with the other instructors, we settled on 7. In fact, they initially only wanted to credit you with 3, but I convinced them otherwise. After all, I know how your summons work the best." "Well, the count doesn't matter that much. I'm just glad I'm actually an elite now." "Do I get paid?" "No. Unfortunate." I clicked my tongue in playful disappointment, causing the puppet master to smirk. Then, I nodded to the walls. I was going to pick off some more stragglers. Go ahead. By the way, you elites will be heading out soon. There are already several reconnaissance missions lined up to be completed. This recent siege was by no means natural and we want to know why, so it's a perfect opportunity to put you all to work. Be prepared for that, but at least for the next 3 days, you all will be free to do whatever you want." "Understood." We all nodded. After that, I went up the walls while the others went to retire. They had been working all day while I was asleep, so I couldn't expect them to accompany me. Heading up to the central tower, I got a good look at the entire battlefield. The dirt ground for the surrounding half-mile was stained entirely red with blood. So many monsters had died that it had soaked the mud. Not even the walls were spared as the bottom half was covered in thousands of red streaks. Not only that, but the massive amount of corpses released a deathly rotten fog. The aura was so palpable that I felt suffocated even from the tower. I promptly took out my air mask, sealing it over the bottom half of my face before communing with a rifle and taking aim. Near the walls there were squads of soldiers moving corpses into massive piles and burning them. They surely couldn't just let them rot, and spells made for easy disposal. But beyond I could spot lots of scavengers and lingering beasts. Some were stalking the soldiers while others were feeding on their dead kin. While there were guards making sure the disposal teams weren't attacked, they also weren't proactively attacking themselves. I was perfect for the job, so I didn't hesitate to pull the trigger and get to work. However, this time, I didn't have Amaro with me. So when my gun exploded with power, everyone on base heard it. Asterisk boom asterisk. The shock wave rang the ears of the soldiers in the vicinity and startled everyone else. All attention was promptly turned to the tower. Nobody came to stop me though, so I continued. Like that, shots rang out for the next hour or so. It was only when the sun set that I had to stop since I couldn't see anything. Who? I took a deep breath after releasing my weapon, sitting up and propping my back against the wall. I sat there for a bit, stewing in my thoughts while taking out a cigar and putting away my mask. Taking a few puffs helped revitalize my body. Staying still for hours on end, especially in the positions that I was in, made my body incredibly sore and stiff. I still felt the remnant aches from the first day of the siege. And then I had slept for an entire day, not making it much better. It was lucky that my mind felt brand new, giving me some relief. All alone in the tower, I was able to get some good alone time. Thinking back, I realized that this was the first time I truly came into contact with a scourge. I didn't really have the time to worry about first impressions, but perhaps the aftermath of the battle was better for that anyway. Just their mere presence was poisonous. In life, they sought nothing but the deaths of everyone at the base. And in death, they infected the landscape and spread their rotten scent. It would take several days of rotting for a normal animal to leave behind the horrid stench they did. But the scourge did so in a mere day. Not only that, but I could sense the poisonous aura coming from all of them. Within each of those bodies was toxic magicka stemming from the black crystals, so it was spread in a subtle way that only those attuned to aura could make out. Where an ordinary person would merely want to vomit from the scent, Amagus would feel like their soul was sickened from being near the terrible aura. They truly were a scourge. They were good for nothing, their only purpose to corrupt the world. At least animals were an integral part of nature, creating an irreplaceable balance. But this world would be better off without the scourge. No, it was more accurate to say that the scourge would need to be eradicated before this world could truly prosper. They were the nemesis of life itself. I now understood that fact, something I hadn't before. And I knew that there was far more to the scourge than just this. This siege was a mere glimpse of what they were capable of, nothing more than a tasting. The kingdom of Dragon Tongue, backed by the power of several immense magical organizations and the church, containing multiple authority 11 magi, had yet to actually defeat the scourge. This meant that there were beasts and enemies that I couldn't yet fathom. It was likely that the only reason humanity had survived until this point was through their intelligence, something that the vast majority of, if not all, the scourge beasts lacked. But, did the scourge also contain intelligent individuals? I thought back to the story about Rayla's late husband, who had been infected and turned into a scourge entity. Did he have or retain his intelligence? Although twisted, it was possible that he could still think with the capacity of a standard human. In that case, the scourge no doubt contained intelligent beings at the helm. It was the only way they could wage meaningful war against the humans, the only way to prevent the humans from systematically wiping them out. It went both ways, after all. If humanity could find a way to fight back against the scourge, then they could find a way to eradicate them. The fact that hadn't happened yet spoke volumes about the depth of the scourge. In that case, what was the scourge? Was it a virus, like a zombie virus? Was it a special species? I was more inclined to think that they were like zombies, but it also wasn't that simple. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I knew about the situation. I had learned a good amount about the scourge, but it was all public knowledge. After all, it was known that the scourge could infect humans. But there were also no mentions of intelligent scourge beasts. Maxwell had spoken of royals and unique beasts when discussing crowns. I had no idea what those were. Not even the Academy spoke of them. My knowledge was severely limited, which oddly seemed to piss me off. But it became clear from today that the scourge was my existential enemy. For a while now I had been questioning the reason for my appearance in this world. I was brought here with my knowledge and a power that allowed me to summon historical armament from Earth. It seemed perfect for dealing with the scourge. I was beginning to think that they were the reason I was brought here. Perhaps I was some sort of saving grace, but then again, I had a hard time believing that I would be able to become powerful enough to bring about any significant change. How could one man fight against an army? It was simply impossible, made only slightly less impossible through cold steel and explosives. Well, either way, I would do what I could. In this world, fighting in the war meant you were protecting all of humanity from ruin. There was nothing political about it. That made it really easy for me to simply accept what I was doing. I felt no remorse in anything I did here, only fulfillment knowing that I was ending a purely evil enemy. Yeah, I need to get better. I chuckled a bit, thinking that I needed to focus more on cultivating my power. Everything went back to that. Just then though, I heard the sound of footsteps going up the stone stairs toward the tower I was in. I looked at the doorway while letting out a smoke-filled breath, watching as Umaru walked through. We stared at each other for a moment before she spoke softly. "You didn't come down." I was brooding. "What about? Come sit with me and I'll tell you about it." She smiled at my words, walking over before taking a seat at my side. We sat shoulder to shoulder as I briefly explained some of my thoughts. And her response was empathetic. "Yes, the scourge is indeed mysterious. At least for us. Perhaps that's to protect us though. I mean, if everyone knew just how terrible their enemy was, how many people would really volunteer to fight? On the contrary, making them seem like mindless beasts that could be easily defended against would inspire the false bravado of everyone who merely wants the glory of the battle without the sacrifice or horror." "That's a good way of putting it. My, how wise of you." I looked at her, slightly impressed. Coming from the perspective of naivety like myself, she displayed a great understanding of the possible unknown. She smiled a bit. "Those words come from my mother." "Oh. You know her. She's powerful and naturally well aware of the threat a scourge poses. The things she tells me about them usually spare the more intense details. She protects me, even though I don't want that. I'm under the impression that I should be exposed to it now and have time to process it. That way I can stay ahead of the curve. I can see the logic in that." I shrugged in understanding, but then I sighed. Unfortunately, age is also important. That in experiencing something traumatic before you're fit to cope with it can be permanently debilitating. Your mind may not have the ability to process it yet, whether you like it or not. Basically, if you trust your mother's objective judgment, then don't rush it. I do trust it. That's the only reason I no longer force the issue. But that doesn't mean I like it. But you're mature enough to understand it, I suppose. She sighed with obvious indignation, as if her maturity were a burden. And I understood her plight, even if not from the same perspective. It was amazing how much a person's mentality changed as they got older. Just a single year could flip your worldview. A single event could impart life-changing experience. I understood that from my time on Earth. It was the only reason I had entered college. I trusted the judgment of my parents who had more experience than I, along with the advice of other adults around me, several of which had expressed their regret over their own youthful ignorance. I knew that I was young and didn't know better, so I followed their directions instead of blazing a trail on my own. Well, I was also fearful of what would happen if I was truly cut off from them, who were my lifeline, but I knew I had enough self-awareness to see the truth. Sure enough, a few years later, my mindset had completely changed. I no longer needed their guidance to see that their advice was true. It was amazing to experience my own evolving way of thought, as if I were spectating my own life. It seemed Umaru was similar. However, after a few moments of silence between us, I could see her fidget and smile weirdly. She seemed nervous. My heart thrummed a bit harder, as if I could predict what was happening. In fact, I could sense her aura get a bit bolder, like she was about to do something big. She could hide little, my senses reading her like a book, only stopping short of being able to hear her exact thoughts. So, I was wondering. Well, there really isn't anything to do here, but there is back at the capital. Anyway, I didn't know if you would be open to the thought of Maybe going to a nice restaurant when we return. I was silent for a few moments while looking over, seeing Umar almost shiver in nervousness. Of course, the fact that I had just been asked out had me a bit fluttery as well, but not nearly as much as her. It was like her life and death hinged on my answer here. Seeing her like this was extraordinary, like seeing an extinct species. I never thought she could get this nervous. All of our interactions prior had been completely cool. She was always rather monotone, almost stoic, except for when she occasionally teased me. Of course, she wasn't robotic. She was just really low-key. Unlike Tana, who wore her heart on her sleeve, she preferred to keep quiet and watch. So this was totally new, getting a glimpse of just how girly she could be. It was unbearably cute. I couldn't even think of anything else as I barely stifled laughter. I felt gleeful. Oh Lord, I've never seen you this nervous. Don't laugh. Please. I'm sorry. I've just never been asked out on a date before. It's kind of magical. I chuckled, thinking that I've always been the one on the other end. Was this how girls felt? Seeing how Umar looked like she was going to explode though, I did my best to control myself and ease her mind. I think a date sounds great. Are you sure? Look at you, being all shy. I laughed as she tried to bury her face in her knees. After a moment though, I nudged her with my elbow. But we'll only be back at the capital in 3 weeks. That's too long. What do you mean? I mean that I like you right now and don't want to wait 3 weeks just to go on a date. Granted, being on a military base does indeed make things difficult, but I'm sure we can figure something out. Who said we can't take a date to the recreation room? Oh. She let out a long relieved breath at my words, causing me to laugh again. Just like that, I had started a new relationship. I could see her smile really wide too. She even rocked back and forth like a kid who just got some candy. But then, she rubbed her chin. I'm not sure about a date to the recreation room. We'll figure something out. For now let's go eat. I stood before reaching out and grabbing her hand, pulling her up to her feet and out of the tower. We headed to the mess hall where they were serving dinner. Very few people were there, so we had some alone time while eating. During that time Umara seemed to calm herself down, returning to her usual quiet self. But as I sat across from her, I couldn't stop smiling, constantly thinking back to how she went about asking me out. I even laughed a few times, causing her to cover her face with her hands. How cute. Tope continued,